Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. My colleagues Daniel Gallen, Mark Brennan on the way on this episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast. Hopefully you caught our post-game episode we brought to you late Saturday, early Sunday morning from Beaver Stadium before closing up shop over there in the press box. Daniel and I spent about 40 minutes breaking down Penn State's 35-6 whiteout game victory over Washington. It pushed the Nittany Lions to 8-1 on the season. They're up to number 4 in the AP Top 25 poll. Of course, the rankings that really matter right now are the college football playoff rankings. We'll get another look at those this week. A lot of recruiting news as well coming out of the whiteout, as always. A couple commitments coming up in the last few days. We're going to dive into recruiting with Tyler Calvaruso on our next episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast, that midweek episode that we've typically brought him on board to break down recruiting. He'll give us the latest on these new commitments and what else transpired in Beaver Stadium on Saturday as top prospects from across the region were in town for the matchup. Without further ado, let's bring in Mark Brennan and Daniel Gallen, who I spent the game alongside on Saturday evening. We've got one more game at least in Beaver Stadium, but the Nittany Lions looking to do their best to earn another home game perhaps in December as the college football playoff rolls around. And Mark, as we always do with our Monday episodes, we'll begin with you. Daniel and I got to say our piece on Saturday night about this matchup. What stood out to you ultimately in a 29-point Nittany Lions win?
To me, it was less about X's and O's and more about resiliency. We were wondering how this team was going to bounce back after a very difficult win, and I don't think they could have done really much better. That's not to say they played a perfect game, but that to me wasn't the important thing. The important thing was coming out, playing with the intensity, the emotion, the athleticism, all of those things that kind of disappeared in the last 5 minutes or so of that Ohio State game. So they did not let Ohio State beat them twice. They didn't beat themselves twice. They came back, and I really think there's something to be said for that in this new era where you have 12 teams. The teams, we saw it again this weekend. I mean, you're going to have an opportunity to bounce back from one win. You may not have an opportunity to bounce back from from one loss. I'm sorry. You may not have an opportunity to bounce back from two losses. Bouncing back from a win is always a good thing. I mean, in my estimation. With respect to the coaching staff, I have covered Penn State football long enough to have covered coaches who were so stubborn that when the media and fans were clamoring for something, they just wouldn't do it for the sake of, being proven right. Now, I'm not saying it's always a good idea to listen to the media and the fans. I would go as far to say it's rarely a good idea to listen to the media and the fans. But in this instance, I think everybody was right. Against Ohio State at the end of the game, they needed to give the ball to Tyler Warren. Against Ohio State, if you weren't giving it to Tyler Warren in a goal line situation, why not bring out Bo Pribula? And I just thought it was pretty cool, and I thought it showed Andy Kotelnicki, you got a feel for his sense of humor, right? Now, did you guys get that when, Bo Pribula comes out early in that game and the whole stadium is like, that was like theatrical. It was like Kotelnicki had to know that was going to happen. And then when they get down there again and Tyler Warren shifts over to Wildcat, again, just the dramatic, the theatrical, you got a sense that this Andy Kotelnicki doesn't take himself too seriously. Let's give them what they wanted. Let's do what we should have done. Basically admit that, he messed up at the end of the Ohio State game. And as much as that may have been a fun thing, I think it speaks to his growth as a coach. And I mentioned this last week. Listen, you're in the first situation where you're in a top 5 game. Every eyeball in college football is watching you and you don't push the right buttons. That's understandable. But if you keep doing it, to me, that's not. And that showed me that he learned. I'm not suggesting I know more than he does. He's forgotten more than I'll never know about football. But the fact that he could still learn from a situation was really big. And then one last thing, I know I'm rambling on. I was blown away by the turnout. I wrote this. I was really wondering if, and you guys know, you were kidding me about it in the press box, and rightfully so. I was wondering if they had diluted this idea of the whiteout so much with the helmet stripe and the energy and what's the other one? Stripe out. All these different things that they did. And then you couple that with the game being on Peacock. And then you add to that the fact that they're coming off of a loss. I was really wondering what the vibe was going to be like in the stadium. And I thought it might not be great, and I was dead wrong. I mean, I thought those fans were unbelievable. Following a tough loss to come out and show up the way that they did, as disappointed as they were, and as vocal as they were in letting people know about that disappointment, they were there when Penn State needed them again. And I thought they were a real factor in that game early on. So I know that was a lot to digest, but you guys had 40 minutes. I figured I'd take a few to just let you know my takes.
It was as good of a tailgate scene that we've encountered here in 2024, at least. I know the night game setup helps for that, but I thought that was a good sign right off the jump. Driving onto campus, seeing people really excited, working their way toward greater excitement through some liquid courage.
Excitement's one word.
What's that?
Excitement's one word.
But you wondered because of the energy in that stadium or lack thereof when we were kind of making our way to James Franklin's press conference after the Ohio State matchup. To get there, I don't know if a lot of people realize, to get from the press box to the press conference, we got to walk through kind of a sea of people. It's kind of like swimming against the current, because got a bunch of angry Penn State fans working their way out of Beaver Stadium after a close loss. We're trying to nudge our way through them, get over to James Franklin, ask some uncomfortable questions, and so to kind of regroup on Saturday and feel that buzz in the air. And I think a big part of this, Daniel, is, and we heard it after the Ohio State game, we certainly heard it again after the Washington matchup when guys were discussing the performance they put out there, is they feel like they still have everything to play for. Usually they come out of the Ohio State game, there's not quite as much to play for. And we've said it, it's a tricky path if they're to get to Indianapolis and compete for a Big Ten championship. But the Big Ten championship game is no longer essentially your bridge to get to the college football playoff. It's not a required part of that journey. And so how much do you think that reality is to credit for Penn State coming out, going 4 straight touchdown drives, playing buttoned up defense, and guys telling us straight to our face after this matchup that they want to get back to Beaver Stadium before Christmas for a playoff game?
Yeah, I think there's a couple ways that you can look at it. I think first, just to go off what Mark was saying about the turnout and everything, I think it was a good reminder that, the X, Twitter, Blue Sky, whatever social media platform you want to be on, that's a very narrow segment of the fan base. Even our message board, as much as we love them, that's another very narrow segment of the fan base. And obviously those are the ones that we hear from the most. And that's, I think, you could feel a certain amount of discontent from that area. But again, that's a small segment. 110,000 people were in the stadium. I think also from our perspective as media watchers, we made a lot of this about this game being on Peacock and what that might do. But in reality, I was kind of thinking about it during the game. I was kind of like, no, the people in here care that this is on Peacock. Right. I mean, maybe there's a little extra juice if they know they're on ESPN or they know they're on some nationally televised over the air thing. But for the person in section EE, might not matter. They're there for the game. So I think that's a couple things that for me coming out of this game, I like to think I take a 30,000 foot view. Maybe next time I need to make sure I'm at a 50,000 foot view. With some of these things. But then going back to Penn State and what they've done on the field, James Franklin has always said it, that you want to make sure that your team can learn these lessons and take steps forward without suffering a setback. But the one thing that we've learned is that when they suffer these setbacks, they're really good at bouncing back. And Mark, I made the point to Tyler after the podcast where, 2 years ago in 2022, after those losses, it was, snap of the finger, they were back. Last year, it took a little bit to get going. You had that Indiana game after the first loss, then that Rutgers game after the second loss. And then in the second game back, they were rolling. So I think it's a really good sign for them to, still be, to start rolling right away. Like Tyler said, it's really tough to see this team in Indianapolis, but I think for them to know that they're still in that mix, they probably they're not going to say that they pay attention to the rankings, but I think to know that there's that number 6 and to see themselves as a number 7 seed in that initial bracket, I think that adds a little bit of security too when you're looking at the big picture of what is in front of them. So I think it's just a good testament to James Franklin and his staff, the coaching job that they do on getting these guys to bounce back, making it very clear to them what is ahead of them. because I think it would be really easy to get wrapped up in that Ohio State loss. I think, a good portion of the fan base was probably wrapped up in the Ohio State loss. Probably some of the media was still wrapped up in that Ohio State loss. But for them to flush it, move on, bounce back, just really good coaching and really good mentality from those players.
There's obviously a lot of discussion about what James Franklin has failed to do with Penn State against Michigan and Ohio State lately, of course. But you look at what he's done against everybody else, and it's also difficult to ignore. Since 2022, they're 28-0 in the regular season, unless it's Ohio State or Michigan lined up. And I know that's not going to be enough in a lot of people's eyes. But you look across college football and some of the losses these programs pick up, some of these ranked teams, college football playoff contenders, Penn State's managed to avoid those kind of surprising losses over the course of these seasons. And if they can do that the rest of the way, they should have no problem punching their ticket for a college football playoff spot. A couple teams ahead of them in the rankings fell over the weekend in Miami and Georgia. And there's just a lot of movement, some chaos. And so far, it's been relatively chalk for Penn State. I think a lot of us maybe anticipated they'd lose to Ohio State. Of course, we predicted, me and Daniel, that they would beat them once we got to the week. But to be at 8-1 right now is a good spot for their playoff outlook. And Mark, we jump over to players of the game now because Penn State put those out after their latest win, offense, defense, and special teams. And you look at what Kaytron Allen did on Saturday, 98 rushing yards on 20 carries. It was the sixth time in his career that he's gone for 20 carries in a game. Only the second time this season. He did that against UCLA, which was another matchup in which his partner in crime out there and Nick Singleton was limited. In that case, he was not available against UCLA. And in this case, we saw Singleton get one carry in the second half. We've got an update on Singleton coming out of James Franklin's press conference, but sticking with Kaytron Allen, Mark, I thought it was really his most impressive performance as a rusher, probably going back to that last game of September against Illinois when they really leaned on the ground game. But he showed that physicality. We also saw some agility from him, some burst. He worked his way to the end zone to make this a 35-6 game in the second half. And if they are needing to lean on him a bit more moving forward, we know that Kaytron Allen is ready, willing, and able to do that. But I thought this was a good sign, an encouraging sign, because the last few weeks, even with Nick Singleton's injury situation being what it was, kind of lackluster on the ground collectively.
Yeah, could you imagine how difficult that post-Ohio State situation was? I mean, I think what's kind of lost on everybody is, while we were all saying that Tyler Warren should have gotten the ball, how do you think Kaytron Allen felt when everybody's talking, saying somebody else should have gotten the ball, when his kind of hallmark has been that he's been a power rusher? What I would say is, yeah, I mean, he definitely deserves a player of the game, but to me, I would have had players of the game on offense and gone with the offensive line, because I don't think Kaytron Allen was necessarily the issue at the end of the Ohio State game. The reason that I like Tyler Warren in that situation is because what we saw against Washington. He can do more than run through the line. He is so big and athletic that he can go over the line. And he did that once, and then he ran through it the next time. I just think it gives you more opportunities to do things. But without the offensive line playing well, I mean, to me, the end of the Ohio State game was more about the play calling and the offensive line not executing. And that, to me, is they came back. Kaytron came back, showed the resiliency I talked about earlier, and the O-line really showed that resiliency. I think they needed to kind of prove some things to themselves, not necessarily to us or anybody else, that they were capable of doing what they did against that Washington team. And it wasn't just rushing. They did a good job of protecting the quarterback. I thought it was a good all-around game. So, yeah, kudos to Kaytron Allen for being player of the game, but don't forget about that offensive line.
Penn State averaged 6.7 yards per carry on the night against Washington. They did not surrender a sack, a tip of the cap toward Drew Allar for his mobility in a couple instances to maybe keep that blemish off the board. But, yeah, clean day for the offensive line. And I want to note here, I know he's been in and out of the lineup in Big Ten conference action, but when he's been playing, and he played a lot Saturday, Anthony Donko has been really, really good. I feel like we don't talk a lot about specific offensive linemen unless sometimes we're saying there's an issue. But I think Anthony Donko, battling whatever he's been battling, in and out of the lineup a little bit, he was essentially there for the full game against Ohio State, despite not starting. I thought he was arguably their best offensive lineman against the Buckeyes. And I think there's a case to be made that he carried that mantle again against Washington. And I think that's a great encouraging sign for a redshirt freshman, first year at tackle. Across the trenches, of course, Abdul Carter commanded the spotlight again on Saturday night. Daniel and I spent quite a bit of time during our post-game podcast giving him his flowers. And when you look at his body of work now, and we've talked about how he's really taken the next step during Big Ten action. All but one of his sacks have been in these conference matchups. I think it's 14 of his 13 of his 15 and a half tackles for loss have been in 6 Big Ten matchups. And Daniel, he now leads the all-power conference players in tackles for loss with 15 and a half. That's 10 more tackles for loss than he had last year when he was a first-team all Big Ten pick at linebacker. I feel like we kind of laid it all out there in the post game, but when Penn State's naming him the defensive player of the week, surprisingly didn't get any other accolades from the conference at large. But I mean, he is the guy now that you look at either side of the football. He may be the biggest priority problem for the opposing coach, and for him to get to that stage here, year one playing defensive end, second week of November with a lot of football still ahead. I'd say he has exceeded expectations, and expectations this preseason were already pretty high for number 11.
Yeah, I think that, excuse me, you look at his full body of work for the season and you can see him getting better and you can see him progressing. And I think that is something that shouldn't get lost in the big, round, raw numbers at the end of the season. I think that that's something that he can, as he moves forward, that he can show NFL teams where his improvement was. I think Deion Barnes can take that on the recruiting trail or into the transfer portal and show, where he's gotten better. It's just a very, very impressive job all around by this Penn State defense, by Abdul Carter, by Deion Barnes. And yeah, I mean, I was surprised that he was not the Big Ten Defensive Player of the Week. UCLA linebacker Carson Schwessinger got that honor. He had 7 tackles and 2 interceptions on Friday night as UCLA beat Iowa at the Rose Bowl. But I wouldn't be surprised if we see Abdul Carter's name pop up on some of the other weekly national awards that come out. I just think that we talk about it a lot when you have a disruptive defensive line and especially a disruptive edge rusher, just how much it can change the game. Washington really got out of what they wanted to do offensively. It was just very clear that Will Rogers was uncomfortable back there. They make that switch in the second half to the more mobile quarterback. And I just think that Abdul Carter, that highlight reel, if you just show that game alone to NFL teams, it's going to be really, really impressive. I know he's probably getting held every play. And I've said it before where, if it's week 11, week 10, they haven't called it yet, they're probably not going to call it. So I kind of move on with it. But if you add that degree of difficulty, it just makes it even more impressive. Teams know what he can do. They're trying to guard against it, and he's still putting up these big-time numbers.
I think earlier I may have said he had 7 sacks on the season. He's got 8 sacks on the season, 7 of them in the last 5 matchups against Big Ten opponents, and only one player in the conference has more sacks thus far on the season. Mark, I think about the recent first-round picks they've had at defensive end. Daniel brought up this point during our post-game podcast about so much of it is based on potential, not necessarily what's been produced. You had Chop Robinson, I think, with 4.5 sacks last year. Odafe Away, of course, everyone remembers no sacks on the board the year he goes as a first-round pick. Abdul Carter is piling them up. I'm wondering, maybe is this sort of what we could have seen from Micah Parsons as a junior if we had been able to see him in 2020 and the opt-out doesn't happen amid the pandemic. But you've got a long history watching Penn State defenders, Mark, the way he's disrupting things right now. Back-to-back 2-sack performances, 4 tackles for loss, and multiple Big Ten games right now. He's got to be stacking up pretty highly, I'd imagine, when you talk about disruptive presences in Penn State's defense that you've witnessed of late.
Yeah, and remember, the last couple games, he's doing it with a very limited Deni Dennis Sutton on the other side. I mean, so that to me makes it even that much more impressive. I mean, imagine LeVar Arrington, without Courtney Brown. I know you guys are a little young for that, but Courtney Brown was an unbelievable player. Both of those guys really made each other a whole lot better. I wrote this after the game, and I have to double check it. I'm pretty sure that I'm right on this, that Abdul has an opportunity to become the first Penn State player to win first-team All-Big Ten honors at 2 different positions, which would be unbelievable. And I think with respect to his draft status, you're looking at a guy now who is as unbelievably athletic as Owe was, or Etor, or some of the people that we've seen in the last few years. This guy brings the versatility of a Micah Parsons. We didn't see Micah Parsons play defensive end at Penn State. but he could have. I mean, we knew what he was all about, and they could have put him at safety, and he could have played there. And I think you're seeing that sort of versatility, and that's what's going to make him so valuable. I mean, I watch Micah Parsons. I hate that he's on the Cowboys, playing against my beloved Eagles, and the way that he can run all over the field and just make plays everywhere. We're seeing a lot of that out of Abdul Carter. So he made a little bit of a gamble, switching positions, kind of bet on himself. And I remember early in the season when he wasn't really stacking up the numbers, I think all of us knew that as he got accustomed, that things were going to start to work. And as Tom Allen figured out exactly what he had in this guy, he was going to find new and different creative ways of using him. And we've seen it. The other thing I like about Abdul, not the most talkative guy. When you talk to him in a post-game press conference, very measured in what he says, but he has embraced the leadership role with KJ Winston going out, who was one of the more vocal leaders. There was really not, there are vocal leaders there, Devon J. Thomas, there are vocal leaders, Kobe King on that, Jalen Reed. I know I'm going to forget somebody, but I think the fact that he's embracing that leadership role is just another sign in his development and something that's going to make him even more valuable at the next level, which is where he'll be next year, obviously.
He told us late Saturday night he's not going to be the guy stepping up and giving the pregame speech before kickoff, but I think you can see from start to finish in these games, he's talking to the other team. He's talking to his team after plays. He's excited about big plays. He's been very demonstrative in that way. I picked up on that against Ohio State when this team kind of seemed to be lacking juice on the field. He was trying to organically fire up some of his guys after plays, and that's certainly what you want to see from a player of his caliber. Zion Tracy was named the special teams player of the week by this staff. He's a guy that on a weekly basis now seems to be getting some love from Penn State coaches. He had a tackle on special teams. He had an 8-yard punt return, protected the ball as well. There hasn't been a lot of scary adventures for him back there as the primary punt returner. Not a ton of splashy highlights as well, but a guy who remains stock up in 2 phases of the game as a sophomore. Before we turn our attention to what we heard from James Franklin on Monday, Daniel, looking back at it, anything that was left unsaid about the offensive performance for Penn State or anything you picked up on that side of the ball that you'd like to discuss here?
I think the more that you think about that first half, the more impressive that it gets, especially in the context of the season where, Penn State had a lot of wins. They had a lot of double-digit wins and comfortable performances, but you didn't really have those games where they were exerting their will in Big Ten play. And against Washington, they really came out and to go up 28-0 at the half, 4 for 4 on their first 4 drives. That's just, the more that I think about it, just the more impressive that gets, especially coming off the kind of performance they had against Ohio State, where you had some questions about who is this team really? Can they run the ball? Are other pass catchers going to step up, et cetera? So I think to come out and make a statement like that, that's something that has really stuck with me since that game Saturday night and since we spoke early Sunday morning. I just think that it's a really great job by Andy Kotelnicki, Danny O'Brien, James Franklin, Jaywan Sider, Ty Howell, that whole offensive staff to have that kind of game plan, go in, execute it, and be able to just put that game out of reach by the time you get to the half.
I think for me, I just kind of reiterating something we talked about in the postgame a little bit is Drew Allar has performed at quarterback to where you are avoiding scary situations against lesser opponents. They're in a dicey spot against Bowling Green. That's not because Drew Allar. They gave up 24 points defensively in the first half of that game. That's why the Bowling Green game was a little bit scary. They scored 34 points that day. I think you look at that the collective body of work for Drew Allar. Again, we talked about this, over 70% completion rating in 6 of the last 7 games. The one exception is he's at 60% against Ohio State. And I think it's worth pointing out, he put that ball pretty damn good on the money from our vantage point for Harrison Wallace in the end zone, a ball that ends up being ruled an interception and a momentum swinger. I'm not putting that on the quarterback. I think he took the blame for it. He's been very good at that. But I think that's important. And his mobility, I think a lot of us, heard it during the offseason, and it was kind of like, yeah, okay, he's going to be a better athlete. I think it's been very apparent, guys, game in, game out, where he's buying them an extra play, or he's preventing a sack that would result in maybe a 3rd and 15, and instead it's a 3rd and short because he's completing a pass, or he's going and running and picking up the first down. James Franklin shouted out his mobility today as something that he said has been a big factor, not only for Drew, but for the offense. And he's got 10 runs now of at least 10 yards on the season. He had 11 of those type of runs in 13 contests last year. So just something worth noting. I just think that Drew Allar's ability to consistently impact the game with his feet, and then consistently not fall into traps and kind of lay an egg in any of these games. There were moments last year, you can talk about where his health was, but much of that game against Indiana coming off a loss, that game against Rutgers where he's banged up, you were wondering where he was at mentally. I don't think we've wondered about Drew Allar's mentality, maybe coming off the Ohio State game briefly, but I thought he answered that question in a big way against Washington. And so, Mark, to me, they haven't all been 350 plus yard performances like against USC, but I think game in, game out, you're getting what you require of QB1. And then you wonder, when they get into a big pressure cooker spot again, can he connect with those wide receivers? Can he make some plays happen? But I think a lot of the pieces have been in place. Feel free to comment on what I just said about Drew, but I also want to throw to you anything that we need to get to defensively before we close the book up on the Washington game.
One thing I would say about offense is I thought they got a little too cute in the 3rd quarter with some things. Ty Warren's throwing passes, 3rd and 4th quarter, things they didn't necessarily need to do. But that said, I think even though they didn't score a lot in the 3rd and 4th quarter, they kept the clock moving and they were able to get some younger guys in. And we'll see what the story is with Singleton, but hopefully they were able to avoid, getting anybody other than that banged up. Defensively, to me, Kobe King has made himself a lot of money this year. I don't think he's going to be a super high draft pick, but I kind of viewed him as a guy who was going to be a borderline draft pick before this season. And I think the way he stepped up and kind of controlled that defense and elevated his game, I think he's going to be one of those kind of middle round picks who has the opportunity to stay in the league for a long time because he's so cerebral and just does, he's basically the quarterback of the defense. And there's a premium on that at that next level. And he's also a guy who at the next level will be able to help you with special teams. So I know that's not that big of a stretch, but I just wanted to acknowledge his play because I think overall their linebacker play has been kind of flat. I think he's been one of the guys who's kind of stepped it up, and I'm anxious to see in these last few games if they start turning to some more of those young guys, give them more of an opportunity. I mean, Rojas looks like that shoulder's really bothering him. Didn't have a real productive game against Washington. Hopefully he's able to get healthy in the offseason because I think that's a tough thing to handle. I don't think you could really get that thing back to full strength during the season. And I think Dom DeLuca is who he is. I mean, he's a leadership guy. He's a hard-nosed guy. He's going to make the plays that are there in front of him, but are there going to be kind of wow plays? So I think there's an opportunity for some of these younger guys in these last 4 games to maybe step up and make a little bit more of an impact.
Talk about that more in just a minute, but beginning with James Franklin's takeaways for us on Monday afternoon in Beaver Stadium, we have a full video of James Franklin's weekly press conference available over at lions247.com. But the headline note, obviously, a little bit of light shed on Nick Singleton's situation. Singleton came out the gates pretty strong against Washington. He has over 30 rushing yards on that first possession of the game. He ended up taking a kickoff to the house as the second half got underway. It was ruled a penalty. It was a good call, but that got wiped off the board. Then we saw Singleton get 1 carry on offense, 1 offensive touch, and then he was the spectator for the rest of the way. And for a while, we weren't sure where he was spectating from because we couldn't spot him on the sideline. And James Franklin referred to it today as a short-term situation. Daniel, he encouraged us to come back after practice on Wednesday and take a look for ourselves for an update on where Singleton might be in his process. We know Katron Allen has said that if Singleton's not available, he's ready to do what he'll need to do. We know that they've got some freshman running backs that will be chomping at the bit for their opportunity, but this is a program that needs Nick Singleton as healthy and as ready to roll as possible if they want to achieve their goals moving forward. So you could understand why, depending on what the nature is, there may be a conservative approach with a 1-8 program on the horizon this Saturday that has yet to beat an FBS opponent.
Yeah, I think that with what James Franklin said, the way that this week is going to go is that we'll go out to practice Wednesday night. see if Nick Singleton is there. Maybe ask James Franklin if there's any update afterwards, and then wait for that availability report at 1:30 on Saturday. See if Singleton is out on the field. See if he made the trip, etc. And then see if he is listed at questionable or whatnot. Then see if he's playing Saturday. I think that's sort of the order of operations with where we are right now with how Penn State and Franklin handles these things. But I do think that we could, either way, I feel like we could see a lot of Katron Allen in West Lafayette on Saturday. But those two young freshman running backs, they've been very intriguing behind the scenes, I feel like, for this entire season. Corey Smith got a chance to show what he could do. A lot of excitement about Quentin Martin and what he could potentially do. We know that they're trying to save both of those guys as red shirts, and they're in position to do just that. So it'll be interesting to see what this looks like on Saturday, but it's just one of those developing stories, and you should follow along at Lions 24/7 for all the developments.
Probably about as open as we've heard from James Franklin about Nick Singleton's status. He says there's been some lingering things he's been working through. They've been trying to manage that. I know Daniel, I think it was coming out of the USC game back in Wisconsin game. That's right. Back in late October, Nick Singleton acknowledged that he has been managing a situation. And so, look, we saw from Nick Singleton, the production was way up. I think he was over 80 rushing yards in each of the first 4 games. Haven't seen him as effective as a runner, though I think he looked closer to that than we'd seen lately early on against Washington. But we know how important he is for this program, and we'll continue to keep tabs on his process. And over at the defensive tackle spot, Mark, the really strange journey of Akeem Beamon has come to an end here at Penn State. There was a year that he was completely absent from the field. I think that was 2021 that we never really got an explanation on. Before that, he was considered a rising figure in this defensive tackle room. He ultimately reemerges. He was a starter for essentially the first half of the season last year. Devontae Thomas takes over that job next to Zane Durant. And by the time we got into November of 2024, Beamon was really pacing as the number 5 defensive tackle behind fellow veteran backups Keziah Izzard and also behind Alonzo Ford, who was really impressed in his year with the program after an injury last year. So Beamon no longer with the team. We learned that was confirmed late last week. James Franklin didn't get into any details on that departure, Mark, but he said they've experienced a lot of emotions together. They've known each other for 7 years, but maybe more now going back to his recruitment. And he just confirmed, very proud of him for graduating, but not with the team anymore. If Akeem wants to share his reasoning, we'll let him get to that when he wants to get to it, Mark. But from an on-field perspective, you're not taking away a guy who was averaging, 20-plus snaps like he had been in the past. That wasn't his role this year. But with Keziah Izzard ultimately unavailable last Saturday, you were down to 3 veterans that you've seen: Alonzo Ford, Zane Durant, and Devontae Thomas. What do you make of the defensive tackle situation, Beamon's departure, and the potential for a young player like a Xavier Gilliam, perhaps a freshman, to stake claim to some sort of a role moving forward?
Yeah, we're having some work done outside. I apologize if it gets a little noisy. It seems like this is the construction capital of the world the last couple of weeks. I wanted to look at the human side of this first, and a guy like Akeem Beamon, a roller coaster kind of career, but he was always really cool with us, really outgoing. Was a guy that you could talk to, and after a game or at media day, and get good quotes, and it'd fill you in about other players to watch and stuff like that. I just really hope that if this was a situation where he decided to walk away, that he doesn't regret it if they get to the playoff and are able to do some things. I can't imagine how difficult it is. Tyler, you chart the snaps, and just looking at those every week, he just wasn't, the snaps just weren't there. And I have to imagine that was disappointing, but I just hope that it's not a situation where he's walking away from something that however many snaps he was playing, he was a part of it. And it's going to suck if he's in a situation where he can't enjoy some of the benefits. So I just wanted to address that part of it. But yeah, from a practical perspective, the fact that they were able to do what they did against Washington without Keziah Izzard, who I have to learn to stop calling Keziah Holmes. You guys get me on that in the press box every game. And then without Beeman, I mean, I think it speaks to the job they've done developing the depth. Alonzo Ford, the way that he's come along. And now, we're at that spot now. Are we going to see some of those true freshmen as this season goes along? Because, it's one thing to really rely heavily on 3D tackles in one game. But, ideally, they want to have 5 people. And let's see who those 5 people are who are going to step up. But Zane Durant obviously playing at a very high level. Devon J. Thomas, to me, one of the guys who, if you would have told me early in his career that this was going to be who he became, I mean, I don't know how often we've seen a guy who, like in his 4th and 5th year or 6th, whatever year he's in, made that many strides. I mean, I remember when they were forced to play him against Iowa when PJ Mustipher was hurt, and he seemed like he was in so far over his head. And now to look back at that to where he is now, what a great transformation, and what a testament to sticking with it, not leaving a situation, not entering the transfer portal when you're not playing, fighting, and then finally getting your opportunity, earning your opportunity. So I think the raw materials are there, or the framework is there with their key guys. Who is going to be plugged in to somebody's spots, though? Caleb Artis, I mean, who else are they, are they going to dip into that freshman pool? That's going to be the fun or the interesting part to watch.
Yeah, and then we got Joseph Mapoye, Vicky Mapoye, who's in year 2. He came to campus as a defensive end. We know he's been getting interior work. You mentioned Caleb, Xavier Gilliam, but really I think that the name that stands out here among the conversation is Alonzo Ford, and what you've gotten out of him coming off of an injury last year. You weren't really sure. He came in from Old Dominion. At that level, he was an all-conference player, but you didn't know how it would translate, and because he got hurt last August, you had to wait a while to figure that out. It's been very good. He was at almost 30 snaps last Saturday. He has been really Mr. Consistent, kind of, took some snaps away from Akeem Beeman along the way. I don't think he's going anywhere in that rotation. But yeah, you're down a body there. You're down a guy with a lot of Big Ten experience in Akeem Beeman. Linebacker is another spot where the depth has been discussed in a very different way. We've pointed to defensive tackle and saying you've got plenty of options there. Linebacker, we've been saying you've got starters, but what is the plan beyond them? And we're still wondering that now with just 3 games left in the regular season. It's been a ton of Kobe King for obvious reasons, as Mark laid out earlier. They're going to feed him the ball. They're going to keep him on the field for long stretches. Tony Rojas hasn't stepped up in the way that we thought he might as a consistent, game-changing kind of linebacker presence. And there's a variety of dynamics involved there, but he hasn't been that kind of guy so far this year. And Dom DeLuca, limited by an injury for much of the season, his numbers are back up a bit. But in terms of others, we heard Tyler Elsdon has been dealing with bumps and bruises. That was from James Franklin today. He hasn't played much at all in the Big Ten outside of that UCLA matchup. And then Tamir Robinson, James Franklin, mentioned him today as a guy that they need to see take the next step. We've been hearing that was maybe going to be the case in preseason football. He was injured early for one reason or another, hasn't come together for the redshirt freshman on defense. And then Zachary Nelson, who made the transition from safety during preseason camp. He stepped up to fill a starting job briefly with Dom DeLuca sideline, but he has really been an afterthought on defense in terms of his involvement. Anthony Specca is a name that we might see. He's a freshman. James Franklin indicated the floodgates are going to be opening up a bit for this freshman class with a few games left, and a lot of the red shirt status kind of solidified for some of these dudes. But Daniel, I think this is something that, as best they can in these next 3 matchups, where we think there's going to be opportunities for some pretty solid margins on the scoreboard, to figure out exactly what you can do with this linebacker group, because it has been a lot of counting on those guys at the top. And I don't necessarily know that you're getting A+, a performance from everybody at the top right now. And there's been a lot of hesitancy, whether it's what they're seeing on the practice field, what they're not seeing, but to implement other players in tight situations, in close games. And I just feel like this is one area on the depth chart that there's certainly some room and maybe some opportunities to put yourself in a better spot for when the postseason rolls around.
Yeah, I think when you look at linebacker, we definitely had questions about the depth coming into the year with Keon Wiley's injury and Kavion Keys' dismissal. You talk about moving Dakari Nelson down from safety to boost the depth there, but that was someone who was a second-year player, a young guy learning a completely new position. So you did wonder. And then I think with some of these guys too, there's the point that linear or development is not always linear. When you talk about Tony Rojas, the arrow had been pointing up for his entire freshman year. Now he's got that adversity that he has to work through. I think with Tamir Robinson, you could make the assumption that, okay, year 2, you can take a step forward. Seemed like he was about to do that through camp, and then you get into the games. It's a little bit different. Dakari Nelson, they talked about how quickly he came along when he made that switch to linebacker. I thought he looked good in that Illinois game when he had to play a significant number of reps. But then you have that settle in. You have some adversity. It's like 2 steps forward, 1 step back for some of these guys, I feel like. So, if you're Penn State, you want to know what you have there, who you can lean on if, God forbid, something does happen to Kobe King, because he has really, really been the centerpiece of that defense and, a really central, glue guy type figure. So I think as you go forward, these are some important games for an Anthony Specca, for a Tamir Robinson, for a Dakari Nelson. If you can get out to a nice lead, get these guys onto the field, get them reps, I think that's really, really important as we look towards the stretch run, especially if you're going to add 1, 2, however many games on in December and January.
James Franklin mentioned a lot of names in that freshman class that they feel like they may be able to utilize on offense, defense, or special teams here with just a few regular season matchups remaining. He talked about defensive lineman Max Granville, Xavier Gilliam, who we addressed earlier at tackle, Jalen Harvey at defensive end. He talked about a couple offensive linemen and tackle Egan Boyer, interior lineman Donnie Harbor. He mentioned running back Corey Smith. He talked about Anthony Specca, some defensive backs, and Kenny Wosley, John Mitchell, Antoine Belgrave Shorter. So it seems like all of a sudden there's a little more roster flexibility. It's almost like when you get to the postseason and your roster expands in baseball, they're going to treat it that way because these players now, 1 game, 2 games for a lot of them. That means you can get 2 or 3 of the next few games. And then once you get past the regular season, you're not worried about that 4-game redshirt threshold. It doesn't apply anymore. So maybe we got a lot more to learn about this freshman class moving ahead. And Mark, I wanted to touch on one more thing with you guys from Franklin's press conference here. And that was his commentary on Penn State's administration. He was asked about where things stand and kind of his rapport with the key decision makers in the administration for the university end and from the athletic end. And he made the point that it's not even close, quote, it's not even close in terms of this being the highest level from a support and commitment standpoint that he's experienced now in year 11 with Penn State. And he said, quote, clearly that includes athletic director Pat Kraft. He said the last 3 years have been a different experience for him from that standpoint. But he said in the year and a half that have followed have taken that to another level as Pat Kraft has gotten more comfortable, maybe has a better idea of what the pecking order of priorities is. And, James Franklin's going to have an opinion on that stuff. Pretty candid stuff from James Franklin. Maybe it doesn't make you feel warm and fuzzy if you're part of the last regime that followed these people. But I think it's a big thing to hear when you are in this modern college football athletics and it feels like everything's an arms race from a football standpoint. When the head coach who's getting paid a lot of money thinks they're doing a pretty good job of that, as good a job as they've done in a decade plus, I think you feel pretty good about that if you're a Penn State fan trying to read the room.
Yeah, I was at the Adams Apple on Friday night meeting with some friends, and somebody pulled me aside and said, that Daniel Gallen is so cerebral. And now he hits us with the linear development. I mean, that is unbelievable. I mean, that's exactly it. So the folks who told me that, this is what we're dealing with. We have a guy who knows about linear development. And, maybe the development of the Penn State facilities was too linear. Maybe it was too flat for too many years that they finally had to get people. It started. I give Franklin so much credit. I don't care what you think about his coaching. Okay. Whenever he's done at Penn State, this program is going to be so much better set up for success. And if he's 10 years, if it's 3 years, if it's however many years, because he forced Penn State to put the resources into facilities that he needed. And I think in Pat Kraft and most of the administration now, you have people who realize the importance of college football. Whether you like it or not, it is the moneymaker. And unless you invest money, you're not going to be able to keep competing and making the money you need to compete at the highest level. So the facilities are there now. And what's the key at this point? I mean, now it's up to the coaching staff and the players to take advantage of that and to bring it to the next level. But yeah, I mean, for years, he kind of beat around the bush for years that he didn't think the athletic director and the administration were taking a lot of this stuff seriously enough. And now you see a guy like Pat Kraft. I mean, how many years were they talking about? And I'm not saying this is all Pat Kraft, but I mean, I can tell you, I mean, I'm probably the best one to address it. They had been talking about Beaver Stadium expansion or renovations or building a new Beaver Stadium for decades and decades. And I don't think it's a coincidence that things are finally starting to happen under this president and this AD and this administration. So you better invest in your football program. And again, other sports may not like that, but football pays for essentially everything. And if you're not investing in those facilities, you're going to be falling behind everybody else. And that's one thing that he may, I'm paraphrasing, but it's like, this isn't like a thing that ends, because it's not going to end at Ohio State. It's not going to end at Clemson or Texas A&M or, all these other places that are investing all this money. You just have to do it wisely. And I think that they are at this point.
Well, we got into the third team defensive tackle conversation. We got into the billions of dollars conversation when it comes to Penn State leadership. So we hit on a few different angles for this episode of the podcast, but that's going to do it for us. We'll be back with another episode midweek. We'll spend some time taking a closer look at Purdue. Penn State is considered a 4-touchdown favorite. I mentioned this earlier, but Purdue 1-8 on the season. That win came against an FCS opponent back in their season opener. So a really struggling Boilermakers squad awaits for 3:30 p.m. kickoff on Saturday. Both Daniel and Mark will be making the trip out there for game coverage. And we'll talk about recruiting as well on our next episode of the Lions 24/7 podcast. Bring on Tyler Caruso, break down the recent commitments, talk about the impact of Target's spending time in Beaver Stadium last Saturday. But for now, big thanks to you, Mark, and to you as well, Daniel. I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.